Hello, welcome to Tales After Midnight. Before we step into tonight's story, take a moment to tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, because uncovering real historical cases like this one takes serious time, effort, and deep research that most stories never receive. Tonight's story carries us deep into Louisiana in the year 1856. Where plantation ledgers and hushed testimonies speak of an enslaved boy whose actions were believed to have triggered the destruction of entire families, leaving a trail of fear that still echoes through history. This is not a legend born from imagination or exaggeration. It has been reconstructed from court documents, private journals, and fragments of history that were nearly erased. What remains is a chilling account that challenges the boundary between fact and something far more unsettling. The boy's beginnings were cloaked in mystery almost from the moment he entered the world. He was born on a vast plantation near the Mississippi River, the child of enslaved parents whose names were barely preserved in official records, if they were recorded at all. From the start, he seemed different from the other children. He was smaller than most boys his age, yet there was something unerringly sharp about him, an awareness that felt far too advanced. The elders whispered that he understood things no child should ever grasp. He watched adults closely, as if studying them. He could predict when work would end, notice conversations meant to be private, and observe the rhythms of the plantation with an accuracy that unsettled those around him. Some said he would stare at the fields or at the main house and smile in a way that made even grown men uneasy, as though he carried knowledge no one else possessed. Even as an infant, there were signs that he did not respond to the world in ordinary ways. He rarely cried like other babies. But when he did, it was sudden and piercing, a sound that lingered in the minds of those who heard it. Older slaves, who had witnessed countless births and raised generations of children, swore there was something unnatural in his presence. There was a quiet intensity about him that made their skin crawl. Mothers who had nursed many children admitted that they felt an unexplained chill whenever he was near. They could not describe it in words, but their instincts told them to keep their distance. As he grew, his behavior only became more unusual. While other children played in the dirt and fields, he spent hours watching. Sometimes he studied the enslaved workers, sometimes the masters, memorizing their movements, their habits, and their reactions. He learned tasks with alarming speed, mastering responsibilities that left adults confused and unsettled. Though small, he was strong. Though young, he was clever beyond his years. And above all, he was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Field hands began to notice strange patterns around him. Objects would vanish or seem to move without explanation. When questioned, he offered no answers, only a blank stare that felt almost invasive, as if it passed straight to the person standing before him. By the time he reached what could be called school age, though formal education was rarely offered to enslaved children, it was already clear that he inspired more fear than affection. Other children avoided him without knowing why. They sensed something in his presence that made them uncomfortable, something they could not name. Stories circulated among the adults that he could influence animals, that horses would shy away from him for no visible reason, and that livestock sometimes disappeared or died under strange circumstances. These whispers marked the beginning of a reputation that would soon spread far beyond the plantation itself. Even the plantation owners began to take notice. Some were impressed by his intelligence and ability, but others felt an unease they could not justify. He followed orders, yet there was always a sense that he was acting on a plan of his own. During work assignments, everything appeared normal at first, but subtle disruptions followed. Tools went missing, crops were damaged, and tensions flared between workers for no clear reason. It was as though the boy was watching everything, learning from everyone, and exerting influence without ever needing to touch anything directly. By adolescence, whispers had transformed into fear. Stories of his unsettling intuition and disturbing behavior spread to neighboring plantations. People began to say he was not merely clever, but dangerous. The earliest family tragedies linked to him began to surface. Mysterious illnesses, sudden accidents, and unexplained misfortunes seemed to follow wherever he was present. To many, this confirmed what they already believed, that he was extraordinary in a way that defied understanding, perhaps even natural law. His intelligence, his awareness, and the strange events surrounding him created the perfect storm for fear and superstition in the antebellum South. Adults warned each other to keep watch over the boy. Some claimed that simply standing near him brought a sense of unease, as though something unseen had shifted in the air. And it was during these early years in this tense and emotionally charged environment that the foundations of the horrors to come were quietly laid. By the time the first official tragedies were recorded, when the first families were marked by misfortune, the boy's reputation had already spread ahead of him. Plantation workers and townspeople spoke in hushed voices about a child who should have been ordinary, but instead carried a shadow with him, a presence no one could explain. Every glance he gave, every small movement he made, hinted at an awareness far beyond his age, at an intention that felt disturbingly deliberate. This was the beginning of the story of the most wicked slave boy Louisiana had ever known, a story that would go on to haunt families, plantations, and even the land itself for years afterward. The first tragedy connected to the boy arrived quietly, almost without warning, yet its effect was immediate and unforgettable. It happened while he was still very young, barely into his early teenage years, though by then he had already developed the unsettling intelligence and awareness that had made him the subject of murmurs among both the enslaved workers and the plantation owners. The family involved was one of the oldest and most respected households on the plantation, with several generations living beneath the same roof. They had known the boy since his birth and had treated him with relative kindness, viewing him as just another child among the many who worked the fields or helped with tasks around the estate. Nothing about their relationship with him had seemed unusual at first. What followed began subtly, through small incidents that were easy to dismiss but impossible to ignore once they formed a pattern. Animals that had always been healthy suddenly grew ill. Horses would bolt or panic without any visible cause. Livestock occasionally vanished, leaving no sign of where they had gone. Tools disappeared from barns and sheds, only to be discovered later broken and abandoned in strange places. Crops that had been carefully planted and tended failed without explanation, even when the weather had been favorable and the labor had been diligent. At first, the family tried to rationalize everything. They blamed bad luck, simple accidents, or perhaps carelessness among the workers. But as these events continued, their discomfort deepened. The coincidences grew too numerous, too closely connected, and they could no longer brush them aside. Then came the first death. It was the youngest son of the household, a boy only a few years older than the enslaved child himself. One afternoon, he became ill without warning. A fierce fever set in, followed by violent convulsions and unbearable pain. Within hours, his condition deteriorated beyond anything the plantation's physician could understand. Despite every attempt to save him, the child was dead before nightfall. There were no wounds, no signs of poison or injury, no visible explanation at all. Only a swift and devastating decline that left the household stunned and terrified. This was the moment when whispers turned into something darker. The boy's presence, his cries, and the strange unease that seemed to follow him suddenly felt connected to the first true death the community had experienced in this way. Grief inside the household slowly transformed into suspicion, and suspicion hardened into fear. They remembered the boy's behavior in the months before the tragedy, the way he watched people with that quiet, unsettling focus, his ability to anticipate events, and the small disruptions that always seemed to occur around him. It felt impossible to accept that a child so young could be responsible for harm. Yet the pattern was difficult to deny. The coincidences were too frequent, too precise, and too consistent. Members of the family began to distance themselves from him. Even adults who had once regarded him as harmless now avoided meeting his eyes. There was something in his gaze that made them uneasy, something they could not explain or name. What made the situation even more frightening was the boy's reaction to the death. He did not cry. He did not show grief or guilt in any way that felt natural to those around him. Instead, he seemed calm, almost attached, as if he were observing events rather than living within them. When people tried to speak to him about what happened, they were disturbed by the sense that he understood far more than any child should, as though he could see the consequences of events before they unfolded. News of the family's loss spread quickly, carried by visitors, overseers, and whispered conversations between neighboring plantations. It was not long before other households, especially those that had frequent contact with the boy, began noticing similar patterns. Small misfortunes grew into serious problems. Arguments erupted without clear cause. Illnesses appeared suddenly and ended fatally. While many insisted it was coincidence, the consistency was impossible to ignore. Again and again, tragedy seemed to align with the boy's presence or even with the sound of his cries. The first family's tragedy became a warning, spoken in hushed voices. It was a reminder to treat the boy carefully, to keep distance, to remain cautious. His reputation changed almost overnight. He was no longer simply an unusual or intelligent child. He became something adults approached with restraint and something others feared openly. Visitors to the plantation, unaware of the long history and subtle observations made by those who lived there, still noticed a strange tension whenever the boy was nearby. Conversations would fall silent. Animals would react suddenly, restless and alert. A heavy unease settled over any space he entered, as though the house itself recognized a connection to what had happened. Later historians and observers would point to this first tragedy as the moment everything changed. It was the first time a death could be linked, even indirectly, to the boy, and it marked the beginning of a chain reaction across the plantation. It was a turning point when people truly accepted that he was not like other children, that something about him carried danger, whether through something supernatural, instinctive cunning, or an unsettling combination of both. Familiarity was replaced by fear. Every movement he made was watched. Every action was examined for meaning. From that moment forward, the boy's presence became inseparable from tragedy in the minds of those who lived there. The loss suffered by that first family was not an isolated event. It was a spark that ignited a growing pattern of suspicion, dread, and the expectation of disaster that would haunt families for years. It was here, in the shadow cast by that first death, that the legend of the wickedest enslaved boy began to take its true form. Boy truly began to take shape, and the belief that his very existence could bring ruin became a terrifying reality for anyone who crossed his path. What had once been dismissed as coincidence slowly revealed itself as a pattern of destruction stretching across multiple households and plantations. At first, it unfolded quietly, almost invisibly. After the tragedy of the first family, others nearby began to experience misfortunes that felt disturbingly familiar, though no one was ready to connect them just yet. Livestock died overnight without explanation. Barns caught fire with no clear cause. Sudden illnesses struck children and elderly relatives alike. Each incident on its own could be explained away, but together they formed a chain that could no longer be ignored. As these events multiplied, the whispers grew louder. People began to notice something unsettling. The boy, always quiet, always watching, and seemingly ordinary to those who did not know his history, was often close by whenever disaster struck. It was not that he was always present at the exact moment, but his proximity in the days or hours before misfortune became impossible to overlook. The second family to suffer had been close to the first, frequently exchanging labor and resources. Their troubles began subtly. The water in their well turned foul, without warning. Crops wilted even though they were carefully tended. The small cuts and injuries became infected in ways that no one could explain. Then, just as with the first household, the true catastrophe arrived. The master of the house fell gravely ill, and within days his wife followed, taken by what the doctor could only describe as a sudden and inexplicable disease. Their children died soon after, one by one, leaving only the enslaved workers behind to witness the devastation. Those who survived were afraid to speak. Even mentioning the event seemed to make the boy's presence feel heavier in their minds, as though the act of naming him gave power to the fear itself. The surrounding community began to pay attention. It was no longer possible to call these events coincidence. The deaths and disasters followed a disturbingly similar pattern. Neighbors whispered about the boy's timing, the way his gaze seemed unnaturally intense, and how his smallest, most insignificant actions always appear to come before catastrophe. His intelligence, once admired, was now deeply unsettling. Some claimed he could influence events without ever touching anything directly, a tool placed just slightly out of order, a word spoken at exactly the wrong moment, a glance that unsettled animals or people alike. Whatever the mechanism, his influence was becoming impossible to deny. By the time the third household fell into tragedy, fear had spread openly. This family had been cautious from the beginning. They kept the boy on the edges of their daily routines, limiting his contact and watching him closely. Yet even their caution failed to protect him. One morning their livestock was found dead in the fields. Soon after, a barn burned to the ground without a single trace of how the fire had started. Then their children were struck by a sudden fever, and within weeks both parents were dead as well. The survivors, mostly enslaved workers who had spent time near the boy, began to avoid him completely. They whispered warnings to one another, speaking of a curse that followed him wherever he went. To the enslaved people who observed him daily, the connection felt undeniable. They had seen his subtle movements, his quiet manipulation of his surroundings, and the strange way he seemed to anticipate danger before anyone else sensed it. To the masters and overseers, however, such explanations were harder to accept. Many tried to rationalize the deaths as poor health, bad fortune, or neglect. But no matter how much they resisted the idea, they could not explain why tragedy followed a single child so consistently. Fear no longer came only from what he had done, but from what people believed he was capable of doing. The fourth family's tragedy pushed the entire region into near panic. This household was wealthy and influential, and many believed they were beyond the reach of such misfortune. Yet their fate mirrored the others almost exactly. Livestock died without warning. Fires broke out in places that should have been safe. Illness struck multiple family members at once. The boy had been known to work nearby, helping with small chores, and the coincidence was too strong to dismiss. By this point, his reputation was firmly established. He was no longer just feared. He was seen as a harbinger of death, a living source of destruction that no natural or human explanation could fully contain. Even towns beyond the plantations began to fear him. Parents warned their children to stay away. Travelers passing through were told stories of a boy whose presence was bound calamity. The stories changed slightly from mouth to mouth, but the message was always the same. Wherever he went, disaster followed. The boy himself remained almost completely silent. He neither confessed nor showed visible emotion in response to the suffering around him. His calm only deepened the terror he inspired. Adults sensed that he understood the consequences of events in a way no child should, as if he could see outcomes long before they unfolded. What made these connected tragedies even more horrifying was their unpredictability. There was no pattern in time or place that anyone could rely on. Disaster was not limited to one family, one plantation, or one region. Misfortune seemed to spread outward like ripples, leaving devastation in its wake. People spoke of curses, evil spirits, and unnatural forces. Yet none of these explanations fully satisfied what they were witnessing. The boy became a living symbol of dread, an entity whose very presence suggested that something had gone terribly wrong in the natural order of the world, that his intelligence and quiet manipulation could not be contained or restrained. By the time several families had been devastated, the boy's presence had permanently altered life on the plantations. Children were kept far from him. Adults approached him with visible caution. Even the most rational overseers admitted that something about him resisted explanation. No one dared to confront him directly, fearing what consequences might follow. He was no longer seen as simply a child. He had become a force, an entity whose existence was bound to suffering and misfortune wherever he went. The connection between the households was no longer debatable. It was a clear and terrifying pattern. This boy, who to an untrained eye appeared ordinary, stood at the center of a chain of destruction that left entire families ruined and their lives forever changed. His presence became a constant reminder that some children are not what they seem, and in his case, intelligence and awareness had merged with something dark, something powerful enough to reshape the fate of everyone around him. Fear, silence, and a repeated failure to stop what was unfolding created an atmosphere that was both desperate and suffocating. By the time the fourth family was struck, the community fully understood that these were not ordinary accidents. Whispers spread to the plantations and nearby towns that the boy carried with him a dark and inexplicable force, though no one could name it or prove it. Enslaved people and free citizens alike approached him carefully, often speaking in hushed tones about his ability to anticipate events or influence outcomes in ways that defied logic. The fear was everywhere, yet almost no one dared to act openly. Confronting him seemed to invite even greater disaster, and no one could predict what might happen if they tried. Efforts to intervene began slowly and with hesitation. Some plantation owners summoned doctors and midwives, hoping there might be a medical explanation for boy's influence. The physicians examined him thoroughly. They noted his physical health, his sharp intelligence, and his unusual composure, but found nothing that explained the calamities surrounding him. Still, the tragedies continued. Sudden deaths, unexplained illnesses, and destruction followed wherever he was known to be present. Frustrated and terrified, overseers imposed stricter rules. They tried to separate him from other children, assigning him chores that kept him under constant supervision and limiting his interactions as much as possible. But even these measures failed. Barns continued to burn without explanation. Animals died suddenly. Illnesses spread in patterns no one could understand. Control only deepened the sense of helplessness. The enslaved community, having witnessed the boy's intelligence and subtle manipulations firsthand, turned to avoidance as a form of protection. Parents warned their children to stay away from him. Workers whispered instructions to ignore him, and even those who once felt sympathy tried to reduce their contact. They believed that direct confrontation could provoke greater disaster, yet silence carried its own weight. Many lived with guilt, knowing they were powerless to protect the families being destroyed and unable to warn outsiders who might cross his path. As fear grew, superstition followed. Some believed the boy was cursed, a vessel for something malevolent. Others thought he was the embodiment of revenge for wrongs that could no longer be traced. There were those who believed he possessed an innate and unnatural ability to influence life and death itself, something beyond science and beyond tradition. Secret meetings were held among plantation owners, where they debated whether he should be sold, punished, or sent away. But every option was filled with uncertainty. Sending him elsewhere might spread the calamity. Punishment had shown no effect. Each attempt to discipline or confine him was followed by more tragedy, reinforcing the belief that he was not just a child, not even entirely human. Fear became embedded in the daily rhythm of plantation life. Workers avoided raising their voices near him. People quietly left rooms when he entered. Masters instructed children to give him space, and even simple greetings were spoken carefully. His presence created a terrible paradox. Acting against him seemed dangerous, yet ignoring him did nothing to stop the misfortune. The community existed in a fragile balance of fear and avoidance, a state that endured for years, with dread hidden behind every glance and every step. Attempts to explain his actions through logic brought no relief. Doctors, clergy, and educated men offered theories, but none were convincing. Some blamed disease or environmental conditions. Others insisted that fear and superstition had magnified ordinary accidents. But the timing and sequence of the tragedies defied probability. Entire households had been destroyed in ways that felt deliberate, and yet the boy never confessed, never acknowledged causing harm, never spoke in a way that revealed intent. His silence only deepened the terror, for it suggested that whatever power he held did not require words or permission or explanation, suggesting awareness, cunning, and a deliberate control over events, whether those forces were human or something far more unsettling. By this stage, the boy's reputation had grown beyond rumor and become legend. Stories traveled across plantations and into nearby towns, warning families to keep their distance from him at all costs. Even strangers passing through the region often heard of him before ever seeing him, and many chose to alter their routes or avoid the plantations entirely. Fear had transformed into a social force, shaping behavior as strongly as any law or authority. Children were taught to recognize him and stay away, while adults, even those who claimed skepticism, moved carefully in his presence. His influence was no longer seen as merely physical or immediate. It was psychological. People spoke of feeling a tension in the air whenever he was near, as though something unseen had shifted. Animals behaved erratically. Fires broke out without explanation. Tools vanished or found damage in ways that made no sense. Families who tried to remain rational eventually accepted that he was the center of a web of misfortune that could not be untangled. The silence surrounding him became intentional, born both from fear of provoking him and from resignation to the pattern of destruction that followed wherever he went. What defined this period most clearly was the absolute inability of anyone, enslaved or free, to stop what was happening. Every attempt failed. Punishment, confinement, separation, and even prayer brought no relief. The boy remained the quiet epicenter of disaster, untouchable yet ever-present. His intelligence and awareness, combined with the precise timing of each misfortune, created a sense of inevitability. Families could do nothing to protect themselves. Every effort to intervene only strengthened the belief that his influence was absolute. Fear and silence became both a shield and a prison for those around him, as they lived in constant anticipation of the next tragedy. In the end, the boy's early years laid the groundwork for his dark legacy. His ability to observe, anticipate, and subtly manipulate his surroundings, combined with the fear and superstition he inspired, allowed him to operate within a network of destruction that no adult could control. The attempts to stop him failed not because of carelessness or neglect, but because his actions and his presence existed beyond the understanding of anyone who tried. The community's fear, fused with his mysterious capabilities, created a cycle of terror that ensured his legend would endure long after the plantations themselves had faded into memory. The final incident that sealed the boy's place in Louisiana's darkest history was a culmination of years of fear, tragedy, and unexplained events. By then, he was no longer viewed as a mischievous child or even as a strange presence. He had become a living symbol of dread, a figure whose existence seemed inseparable from death and ruin. Families had already been destroyed, livelihoods shattered, and entire communities spoke his name with a mixture of awe and terror. What followed would guarantee that his story would be remembered long after the fields had grown silent. As with so many events before it, the incident began quietly. A nearby plantation reported livestock dead overnight. Several cows and chickens were found lifeless, and a fire had broken out in one of the barns, leaving workers scrambling to save what little they could. Tools disappeared. Stored grain spoiled without explanation. Crops that had seemed healthy began to fail in scattered patches. Although strange occurrences were expected wherever the boy was near, this time there was a growing unease because everything felt more intense, more concentrated. The boy himself appeared calm, almost detached, as though he knew the consequences of what was unfolding and accepted them as unavoidable. The true catastrophe struck when an influential family, long believed to be beyond the reach of misfortune, suffered a sudden and devastating loss. Within days, the father became gravely ill with symptoms that baffled the local doctor. His wife and children followed one after another in rapid succession. The speed and severity of the deaths were unlike anything seen before. There were no visible causes, no outbreak of disease, no accident, no environmental factor that could explain what was happening. Those who had once dismissed earlier tragedies as coincidence could no longer deny that something beyond understanding was at work. What made this final incident especially horrifying was that it unfolded in full view of the community. Neighbors came to offer comfort, only to find the boy nearby, watching with an unsettling calm as events progressed. Adults who had once tried to discipline him or isolate him now stepped back, terrified that any interference would only make things worse. Even the enslaved workers, who had lived alongside him for years, approached it with a mixture of reverence and fear, whispering prayers as they watched the destruction spread. Attempt to intervene proved useless. Local authorities and plantation owners tried to quarantine the boy, confining him to a single area of the property. Yet misfortune continued to strike, regardless of where he was kept. Wherever he was placed, disaster still followed. Fires broke out in distant fields, livestock continued to die without explanation, and illnesses appeared in the same cruel pattern that had been forming for years. The boy's silence and unshaken composure only deepened the fear. It suggested that he understood the consequences of his presence in a way no one else could. His calm, steady eyes seemed to look straight through anyone who dared meet his gaze, leaving behind a chilling sense that he was in control of events far beyond human understanding. The final blow came when the last surviving members of the influential family died under mysterious circumstances, leaving their household completely erased. By then, the pattern could no longer be denied. Wherever the boy was, misfortune and death followed as if drawn to him. The plantation workers who remained were left to tend empty fields and abandoned homes in silence, afraid that any attention might somehow attract him. Even neighboring families, who had once crossed paths with him without hesitation, began to avoid the area entirely. The plantation became isolated, surrounded by a weight of dread that would linger for years. This moment sealed his reputation as the wickedest enslaved child in Louisiana's history. Whether his influence was supernatural or the result of an uncanny ability to manipulate his environment no longer mattered. What had once been questioned was now accepted without hesitation. Stories spread across the region, carried in whispers by workers, overseers, and nearby families. They spoke of his unsettling intelligence, his silent observation, and the unexplainable chain of deaths and disasters that followed wherever he went. His name became legend, a symbol of fear that surpassed his age and turned him into something almost mythical in local memory. After this final tragedy, plantation owners and local authorities came to understand that traditional forms of control were useless. Attempts to punish him, sell him, or remove him only seemed to invite more disaster, reinforcing the belief that his presence alone carried destructive power. Fear became the guiding force of the region. It shaped how people spoke, how they traveled, and even how goods were moved between plantations. Families who had once believed themselves protected now lived with constant vigilance. And even generations later, tales of the boy's wickedness were told as warnings to children and newcomers. The final incident was more than a personal catastrophe for those directly involved. It reshaped the collective mind of the community. The boy's life and actions became a reminder of how fragile human control truly was, and how easily it could be undone by forces that defied understanding. He was no longer just a child bound to a plantation. He had become a force that history itself could not overlook. And here on Tales After Midnight, this is a kind of story that reminds us why such legends refuse to fade. From that moment forward, the tale of the wickedest enslaved boy became inseparable from the land itself, woven into whispered histories, fearful traditions, and the memories of those who lived long enough to speak of it. This ending ensured that his legacy would endure. The boy's uncanny intelligence, combined with the tragic pattern of destruction that followed him, created a legend that outlived his own lifetime. Even as plantations were abandoned or transformed with time, the memory of what it left behind remained a dark current running through Louisiana folklore. This final incident was a moment that carved his name into history, not as a mischievous or clever child, but as a singular figure whose existence forever altered the lives of entire families and left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of the region.